Hello, this talk is on Sandro Botticelli. He was an Italian painter of the early Italian Renaissance, and his reputation declined until he was rediscovered in the mid-19th century by the Pre-Raphaelites, and they stimulated a reappraisal of his work. He painted a wide range of subjects, religious subjects and others, mythological works, like The Birth of Venus, from which he's probably best known, and Prima Vera. And both those works are in the Uffizi in Florence. And this particular face is from The Birth of Venus, is Venus. His works are now recognised as quintessentially examples of early Renaissance art and admired for their lyrical beauty and complex symbolism. But let me start with an overview of his life. He was born Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Filipepi, and he was born in Florence in 1445. We don't have a self-portrait, but we believe he painted this self-portrait as part of Adoration of the Magi, which we'll see later. And in fact, he lived all of his life in the same neighbourhood of Florence, and he was buried nearby. The only times he was away from Florence was a brief period in Pisa in 1474 and the painting of the frescoes in the Sistine Chapel in 1481 to 1482. Now, he began his artistic career as an apprentice to a goldsmith called Botticello, which is how he got his nickname, Botticelli. Around 1462, he entered a major workshop, the renowned painter Fra Filippo Lippi, and that's where he developed his skills and created his distinctive style. Then in the 1470s, he established his own workshop, gained recognition for his talent, caught the attention of the powerful Medici family and became their favoured artists. And from then on, he received some of his most famous commissions. In the 1480s, specifically 1481, he was invited to Rome by the Pope to decorate the newly completed Sistine Chapel. And he continued to produce masterpieces after that. He shortly returned back to Florence, where he received many commissions. It was the high point of his career. Then in the 1490s, there was a shift in his work. He came under the influence of the fervent preaching of Girolamo Savonarola, and his later paintings, we'll see, took on a more austere and emotionally charged character. But by the 1500s, his popularity was in decline as new high Renaissance styles and artists appeared, the Leonardos and Raphaels and Michelangelos. He never married. He expressed a strong dislike to the idea of marriage. There was an anecdote recorded by his patron, and his patron suggested he marry. And Botticelli said that a few days before he'd dreamed he'd married and woke up, in his words, struck with grief. And for the rest of the night he couldn't sleep. He walked the streets in order to try and remove the thought of the dream from his mind. I'm not sure of the significance of that, but that's what's reported. He might have had a close relationship with a woman that I'll be referring to later, Simonetta Vespucci, and it's claimed, especially by John Ruskin, that she was portrayed in several of his works and was the inspiration for many of the female figures in his paintings, although other art historians, such as Ernst Gombrich, have dismissed all of this as a romantic myth. As I said, he lived in Florence, in the same part of Florence, for most of his life. He lived with his family. He died in 1510 in Florence, and he left behind him a legacy that wouldn't be rediscovered and celebrated for over 300 years. So in 1470, the 25-year-old Botticelli received his first major independent commission, and it's to paint this Fortitude, which was one of 7 virtues to be painted for the Tribunale della Mercanzia in Florence. And this was a significant milestone in his career, and it was a showcase for his emerging talent and his style. He had recently set up his own workshop in Florence, and this commission came through his connection with the Pollaiuolo brothers, who'd been tasked with creating this series of virtue paintings, but for various reasons were unable to complete the set, so they asked if Botticelli could help. And Fortitude, shown here, shows a female figure on a throne holding a mace and a shield. The painting demonstrates his mastery of line and form, the figure's graceful pose, the flowing drapery, all indicate the influence of his former master, Fra Filippo Lippi. Interestingly, the model for Fortitude is Smeralda Brandini, who was the wife of Mariano Filipepi, his brother. And I think this personal connection to the model adds an intimate touch to the allegorical figure. Notice that she's in a shell-shaped niche, which is something that we'll see recurring in other of his work. And the architectural detail, I think, adds depth to the composition and also reflects his interest in classical architecture and classical forms. As I said, this was intended to be part of this series of virtues, but Botticelli's interpretation was so unique, so distinctive from the others, that eventually it was displayed separately. It's a bit difficult to see in this reproduction, but he used real gold leaf in the painting, in the figure's hair, in details of the armour, and he will continue to use this technique throughout his career, the addition of small amounts of gold leaf to reflect the light and enhance aspects of the painting. Another thing we see with a lot of his paintings through X-ray analysis is that he did make changes to the composition during the painting process. In this painting, for example, he adjusted the position of the figure's arms and altered the design of the throne slightly, showing, I think, his meticulous approach to perfecting his art. Around 1474, he painted this, the portrait of a man with a medal of Cosimo the Elder. Demonstrates his skill as a portraitist and his connection with the Medici family. Although this was commissioned by the Medici, we don't know who the man is. We do know about the medal. The medal that he's holding, first of all, it indicates a revival in the interest in classical antiquity, because they were finding coins and medals from antiquity, and so this creation of this medal was a reflection of that interest. It was produced by a sculptor, Bertoldo di Giovanni, and what Botticelli has done is he's demonstrating his technical virtuosity by including this a sort of trompe-l'oeil element, the medal, which was unusual. I think it was really unique to show an object, an innovative technique at the time. Also, the landscape, the detail in the landscape of the background may reflect Northern European influences, because this was again an innovation brought in by Botticelli. And again, the X-ray analysis shows that there were changes made during the painting process, the positioning of the hands, for example. In 1475, he painted this religious painting, Adoration of the Magi, for a church in Florence, the Santa Maria Novella. And it was a significant moment in his career. He was by then, by the mid-1470s, firmly established in Florence. He enjoyed the patronage of the Medici family, particularly Lorenzo de' Medici, the Lorenzo the Magnificent, as he's known. And the connection is evident in this painting because several members of the family are shown as the Magi and their retinue. Incidentally, on the right, you can see what's believed to be the self-portrait that I showed you earlier in detail. The three kings are presenting gifts to the infant Jesus, and Botticelli has it was an innovative move. He's placed the Holy Family in the centre, with the Magi and their entourage forming a semicircle around, and by doing that he's able to display the portraits of numerous figures who are believed to be contemporary Florentines. So he's been able to include a lot of people, mostly we believe from the Medici family, and this unites this significant religious event with the grandeur and opulence of the Medici court and the wealth of Renaissance Florence. So he's combining the biblical story with the current court of the Medici and of Florence. On the left in the background, you can see a ruined classical arch, and that is a reference to how this new Christian era was replacing the old order of ancient Rome. And a small point, recent analysis has shown that Botticelli used a technique called incisione, or incisions, made with perhaps the end of the brush or a stylus, to create some of the intricate details in the figure's hair and the horse's mane. The sort of waving, the paint is the tempera paint is incised to make these particular elements of the painting stand out. This is 1480. He painted St. Augustine in his study. It was a commission again, the Church of Ognissanti in Florence, and it's again a high point, the 1480s, in his religious work. Shows his mastery of perspective and of symbolism. St. Augustine was, of course, one of the great fathers of the Christian Church. He's shown in his study, and Botticelli is showing a moment of divine inspiration. He's got his hand on his, or near his heart. His eyes are gazing upwards as if he's just received a vision. He's shown as a learned scholar, and you can see a number of books, one of them open, Scientific Instruments, and other objects reflecting his scholarly pursuits. Again, his Botticelli's use of perspective creates this sense of depth and realism. And this is also a painting where there are small elements of gold leaf to add to the luminosity of the painting. And in this painting, infrared reflectography shows extensive underdrawing. So this was a very carefully planned painting. It's a complex composition, and so he worked it all out as a drawing before applying paint. Now, in 1481, he was summoned to Rome by Pope Sixtus IV to complete frescoes for the newly finished Sistine Chapel. The works can still be seen around the walls of the Sistine Chapel, but probably most people who visit the chapel go to see Michelangelo's ceiling, which wasn't painted until 27 years later. So these frescoes were the original decoration of the recently completed Sistine Chapel, and this is one of 3 works that he was commissioned to produce by the Sistine Chapel. He painted them. They're large works, over 5.5 meters wide, and he painted them with his pupils from his workshop. The other wall frescoes, they're not, all the frescoes aren't by Botticelli. There are frescoes by Pietro Perugino, who was there when Botticelli arrived, Cosimo Rosselli, Luca Signorelli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and these were the leading artists of the late 15th century that were called in by the Pope to decorate the Sistine Chapel. The theme we see here is, well, the overall theme, what the Pope was bringing about was to show parallels between the life of Moses and the life of Christ, in order to show the continuity from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and in addition to show how divine law passed from the Old through to the New to Jesus, and then to Peter, the alleged first Bishop of Rome, and then through all of his successors, thus legitimizing the authority of the Pope all the way back through Peter, Jesus, back to the Old Testament, Moses, and all the way back to Adam. What we see here is Moses, and you can recognize Moses. He's the one wearing this yellow garment with a green cloak. On the right, in the foreground, he's shown killing the Egyptian who harassed a Hebrew, as described in Exodus. We then see him fleeing into the desert behind. In the trees, he's fighting the shepherds who were preventing Jethro's daughters from taking water for their cattle. And in the middle foreground, you can see Moses taking water for them. In the upper left corner, Moses has removed his shoes and is receiving from God the task to return to Egypt and free his people. And then finally, in the lower left corner, he's driving the Jews to the promised land. Incidentally, the woman with the pot on her head, I should point to her, this woman, is thought by some to be Simonetta Vespucci, of which more later. In 1482, he returned to Florence, and one of the paintings he created was this Pallas and the Centaur. It's an allegorical painting showing his mastery and knowledge of mythological subjects. And this was the height of fashion at the time in Florence, to study ancient literature and discuss it amongst the humanist circles in Florence, of which Botticelli was a part. It was likely commissioned by Lorenzo Medici for his palace in Florence. And we're now, of course, at the peak of Botticelli's career. He was deeply involved with the Medici. He was immersed in this Neoplatonic philosophy that was popular and much discussed in Florence. And this painting is showing a blending of classical mythology and some of the contemporary philosophical ideas that were being discussed. It shows Pallas Athena, who was the goddess of wisdom. She's grasping the hair of a centaur. And this is an allegory of how reason, Pallas Athena, triumphs over man's baser instincts, the centaur. And we can see Botticelli's distinctive style, the graceful, elongated figure of Pallas, the detailed rendering of her elaborate dress, which is adorned by symbols of the Medici family emblem, the landscape background, which adds depth. Interestingly, this painting was lost for centuries and only discovered in 1895, and it was discovered in the Pitti Palace. It had been rolled up and stored away for centuries, which led to some damage since restored. And again, some say the figure of Pallas was modelled on Simonetta Vespucci. Let me say a bit more about her. She was a renowned Florentine beauty, and she appears, it's thought, in several of his paintings. However, she died aged only 22 in 1476 and was regarded as the greatest beauty of her age. Now, she'd already died some 6 years before, but it's possible Botticelli carried an image of her in his memory that inspired his famous beauties. Some art historians, including the famous Victorian art historian John Ruskin, suggested Botticelli fell in love with Simonetta, but this is based on the flimsiest of evidence, and most art historians think that he was, or everyone was aware of her beauty, and that that may have influenced him in the representation of idealized beauty. So in that sense, she is being represented, but she's abstracted and idealized. The olive branch that she's holding is rendered with botanical accuracy, showing his keen interest in the observation of nature. And we also know through technical analysis he used a particularly fine ground layer for the underpainting, and it's that gives the smooth, luminous quality to the surface of the painting. So now we come to one of his most famous works, 1482, Prima Vera, or Spring, commissioned by Lorenzo Medici for his townhouse in Florence. It's a large mythological painting. It shows a group of figures in a lush garden setting. In the centre is Venus. On the far left is Mercury, then the three Graces, and then the other side of Venus, Flora and Zephyr, arranged around Venus. It's a complex painting layered with symbolism, reflecting the Neoplatonic philosophy that I mentioned earlier. Again, we see his signature style, the graceful, elongated figures. And also, I mentioned the attention to detail he gave. In this painting, there's over 500 plants, and they are botanically accurate, showing his mastery of drawing, of line, his ability to create this sense of movement through subtle gestures, flowing drapery. We believe it was hung above a daybed in Lorenzo's bedroom, suggesting it may have had a private possibly educational purpose related to love and marriage. Also, recent analysis has shown extensive use of a green earth pigment in the underpainting, and this is a technique he continued to use, and it gives a unique tone to the flesh in these paintings. And lastly, the figure of Flora, you can see her hand is holding roses, which symbolise the pure and perfect nature of the heavenly garden. And there's a lot of other symbolism in this painting still being analysed and discussed by art historians. In 1483, he created this Madonna of the Magnificat. It's a tondo, that is a circular painting, and it shows his mastery of this uniquely Florentine format. It was commissioned for a private palazzo in Florence and shows the growing demand for devotional art amongst wealthy patrons. What we see here is the Virgin Mary writing the Magnificat, which is a hymn of praise from the Gospel of Luke, while holding the Christ child. They're surrounded by angels, and the circular composition emphasises the harmony and unity of the figures, the way that he's included them in this difficult composition in this circular painting. Again, he's used gold leaf in parts of the painting, like the halos. And the models for the Virgin, Child and the angels are believed to be members of the Medici family, possibly Lucrezia, the mother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and one of her grandchildren. And this personal touch was common in Renaissance art, and it helped patrons to connect more deeply with religious subjects. Incidentally, the text from the Magnificat in the open book is accurate, the actual text, demonstrating his attention to detail again. And final point, what the Christ child and the Virgin Mary are holding is a pomegranate, which is a symbol of the resurrection. Around 1484, he painted Portrait of a Young Woman. Now, this is also called Portrait of Simonetta Vespucci. Her name has cropped up again. You may wonder how it could be her portrait when, as I said, she died in 1476. Her reputation continued after her death, and it's possible, as I said, that this could be an idealized portrait of her, which may have inspired Botticelli because of her alleged beauty and charm. You've got to remember as well that many of the portraits painted at the time were often idealized. It wasn't seen as to be necessary to represent someone with detailed accuracy. It was expected that they would be idealized, and particularly with women, a celebration of their beauty. She's shown in profile. This was a popular format in 15th century Florence. Note the graceful lines of her neck, the intricate detail of her hairstyle and dress, all typical of Botticelli, who combined realism and idealisation. The hairstyle, very intricate, these pearls and ribbons interwoven in these elaborate braids. This was the fashion in Florence at the time. It may have been part of a pair of portraits, the other one possibly depicting Giuliano de' Medici, but if that is the case, the piece, the companion piece, is now lost, if it ever existed. And now we come to his iconic masterpiece, painted in 1485, commissioned, we believe, by the Medici family, The Birth of Venus, I think representing the pinnacle of his artistic achievement and embodying the ideals of Renaissance humanism. We see Venus emerging from the sea on a giant scallop shell. She's blown towards the shore by the winds of Zephyr and Aura. She's being greeted by a female figure, possibly representing spring, who's offering her a cloak to hide her nakedness. The composition was revolutionary for its time. It was not known to present a large-scale nude figure in a non-religious context. Now, the myth of the birth of Venus, this is told by Hesiod, was that the severed genitals of the sky god Uranus were cast into the sea by his son Cronus, and this created foam in the sea from his semen, from which Venus emerged fully grown and then blown towards the shore, as you see here. Again, you can see all of the signs of Botticelli's style that I've been mentioning before, the sinuous lines, the elongated figures, the almost ethereal quality of Venus, showing his mastery of the tempera technique and his ability to create this luminous surface and otherworldly atmosphere of the scene. Interestingly, it's painted on canvas, which was unusual at the time, more than the traditional. Traditionally, it would have been a wood panel, an unusual choice for a work this large and important step at the time. He may have been influenced by Venetian practice, which is in turn influenced by Northern European practice. And incidentally, the sea was originally much bluer. He used azurite, which has degraded, leaving this greenish colour we see today. And another detail, the trees on the right are an orange grove, and oranges were associated with the Medici family, so it's a subtle link between this mythological scene and his patrons. Around 1485, he created Venus and Mars, now in the National Gallery, London. And it shows again his mastery of mythological subjects. It was commissioned for a Medici wedding. Could have been a piece of bedroom furniture. And it shows Venus, the goddess of love, watching over the sleeping Mars, the god of war. It's set in a lush forest clearing. We see playful satyrs in the foreground, and it shows love clearly triumphant over war, which was a popular theme in Renaissance art. We can see again his style in the graceful elongated figures, the detailed rendering. Note Venus's diaphanous gown. Note the intricate armour of Mars that the satyrs are playing with. It's a carefully balanced composition, horizontal format. Again, some believe the model for Venus was Simonetta Vespucci. The little satyr on the bottom right corner is holding it. It's not an apple. It's a type of fruit called a love apple, or I think its other name is a Chinese lantern plant, and it was associated at the time with love and fertility. You might just be able to make out here, if you look to the right of Mars's head, you can just make out some wasps buzzing around his head, and that may be a pun on the Vespucci family name. Vespucci means wasp in Italian. Vespa, not Vespucci. Vespa means wasp in Italian. And this is another painting where he used green earth pigment in the underpainting to give the flesh this unique, slightly cool tone of that you see in the figures. Around 1487, he painted Madonna of the Pomegranate, again a tondo, exemplifying his mature style. Likely it was commissioned for a private chapel again in Florence. We see the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child surrounded by 6 angels, probably idealised portraits of members of the family. The pomegranate, that they both hold, is again, as I said, a symbol of the resurrection. And there are layers of theological meaning in the work. Between 1489 and 1490, he painted this, the Annunciation, showing his evolving style, his continued engagement with religious themes. It was commissioned for the Church of Santa Maria Maddalena di Pazzi in Florence. And Botticelli was still a prominent figure in Florence, but political and religious changes were taking place which were beginning to affect the city's cultural climate, and Florence was starting to come under the influence of the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola. The painting here depicts the moment when the angel Gabriel announces to the Virgin Mary she'll become the mother of Jesus, and he's interpreted it in a intimate and emotional manner, again with a detailed landscape in the background giving depth to the painting. His graceful figures and poses, and the carefully thought through linear perspective to create depth in the room. The garden outside, the walled garden, is a symbol again of Mary's purity, and the enclosed garden represents paradise. And again, we know through X-ray analysis that he made several changes to the composition. For example, the position of the angel's wings was changed, showing his attention to detail. Now this is interesting. The Calumny of Apelles, 1495, it's a very complex allegorical work, and it reflects the turbulent political and religious atmosphere of Florence in the 1490s. It wasn't a commission, it was a personal project, showing his engagement with the humanist ideas of the time. But I think there might be more to it than that. At the time, Florence was now strongly under the influence of Savonarola, and in fact the Medici had left Florence the year before, 1494, and Savonarola was preaching to the population of Florence about the corruption of the city, its luxury, and he created what is known now as the Bonfire of the Vanities, where he had bonfires in which everyone was encouraged to bring all their finery, all their luxurious goods, and burn them on the bonfires. And we know Botticelli, like many artists, was deeply affected by Savonarola's message, and it's possible, we don't know, it's just a guess, it's possible that Botticelli brought some of his work, particularly the mythological work, and burnt it on the bonfires. But here we see the Apelles represented, who was a Greek painter. His work is lost, but we know about it through the ancient writer Lucian. And what's going on here is that there's a false accusation. Maybe it's clearer if I go through it a person at a time. I think it's worth doing because I think there might be a hidden message here. On the right, there's King Midas on the throne, and he's shown, if you look carefully, with donkey ears, representing the foolish ruler who listens to falsehoods. Either side of him are representations of ignorance and suspicion, and they are whispering lies into his ears and trying to poison his judgment so that he cannot discern truth from lies. Then calumny is the one who, dressed in blue and white, who's dragging the figure that's being slandered, the victim, the innocent man, by the hair. She's shown with a torch in one hand and is being led by another figure towards Midas. And the other figure, dressed in dark clothes, is Envy. And he's leading or pulling calumny towards the throne, and he's the motivator of slander driven by malice and jealousy. And then either side of calumny are deceit and fraud, and they're adorning her with garlands and enhancing her beauty, symbolizing falsehood and manipulation and supporting the slanderous accusations. Then there's the victim being dragged along by his hair, the innocent man nearly naked, helpless in the face of false accusations, showing his pleading gestures, indicating the powerlessness of those wrongly accused. There's a belief that the figure of the victim being dragged is a self-portrait of Botticelli himself. And that interpretation suggests that Botticelli may here be expressing his personal experience of being falsely accused or misunderstood in his lifetime. Florence at this time, remember, was rife with political intrigue and accusations, especially under the influence of Savonarola. And it may be that Botticelli's was known to represent these mythological scenes which were seen as being pagan. So it could be that he'd been falsely accused, and that led to him painting this figure. Just to finish, Remorse is the figure in black on the left, dressed in mourning clothes. She's looking back with regret and sorrow, turning away from the scene and looking towards Truth on the far left, depicted as a naked woman, where her nakedness represents her purity and transparency, and she's furthest from the scene, representing or symbolizing that truth is sometimes distant and difficult to reach, but ultimately will be the force that prevails, we hope. Notice his style is changing. It's getting darker. This is 1500. This is the story of Virginia, and shows his later style. His style was evolving in response to the changing cultural and religious climate in Florence. The Virginia is a Roman woman whose tragic fate led to significant political changes in ancient Rome. It's a story that's told by Livy, and it's a story that tells of how Appius Claudius, who was a corrupt patrician, one of the Roman decavires, the 10 men in power, became infatuated with Virginia, and his desire for her, knowing she was already betrothed, he devised a plan to take her by force. And he has one of his henchmen falsely claim Virginia was not actually the daughter of her father Virginius, but his slave, And if she was a slave, that would allow Appius to seize her legally. Appius was a very powerful person in Rome at the time. As I said, he was a member of the Decemvirs. Virginius, her father, realizing the legal system was stacked against him because of Appius's power, takes drastic action. He pleads for a moment alone with his daughter, and then, in a heart-wrenching decision, kills her with a knife to save her honour and prevent her being taken by Appius. And her death sparks outrage amongst the Roman people and leads to the downfall of the Decemvirs. So Botticelli is painting this sombre, intensely emotional painting depicting the defence of honour and virtue and resistance against tyranny and fate and injustice. This was also painted, we believe, in 1500. It's now in the National Gallery in London. It's Mystic Nativity. It's the last work that I'm going to show you of Botticelli. As I said, in his final 10 years of his life, his reputation, or popularity perhaps is a better word, his popularity faded as new artists were coming along with new styles, and he was beginning to be seen as a yesterday artist. This is a significant work. It reflects his intense religious atmosphere of Florence and the intense religious beliefs of Botticelli. It wasn't a commission, it's a personal work reflecting his own spiritual concerns. In 1498, Savonarola he was burnt at the stake. He had been executed by the church because although he began by criticising the corruption in Florence, he ended up criticising the corruption of the church, and that was too much for the church. He was deemed to be a heretic. But, of course, he had already deeply influenced the Florentines with his teaching, and they were now grappling, because he'd been declared a heretic by the church, grappling with questions of faith and the role of art in spiritual life. What we see here is a nativity. Above the traditional stable, we see heaven with angels dancing in a golden light. At the bottom, there's tiny devils fleeing into the cracks of the earth. Botticelli's style is changed from his earlier classical works, less idealised, more expressive, greater spiritual intensity rather than physical beauty. Interestingly, this is the only painting by Botticelli with a signature and a date, which are written in Greek at the top of the canvas. And the inscription is from the Book of Revelation, suggesting Botticelli believed he was living in apocalyptic times. Another detail which is interesting, if you look at the bottom, you can see embracing pairs. They are angels and men, symbolising the reconciliation between heaven and earth brought about by Christ's birth. And again, infrared reflectography shows extensive underdrawing. This was a very carefully planned and complex composition. The Vasari, who lived in Florence from around 1527, said that Botticelli died ill and decrepit at the age of 78, after a period when he was unable to stand upright and moving around without the help of crutches. He died in May 1510, although it's now thought he was something under 70 at the time. So that brings me to the end. In some ways, Botticelli lived a quiet and protected life because he lived in the area where he was born. He didn't venture from Florence that much. He did, of course, go to Rome, but it was only for a brief period. It was a time of enormous turbulence in Florence, however, and that affected Botticelli deeply. And we see that in the way that his style changed over the years. And from these light, airy, mythological paintings like The Birth of Venus to the darker, meaningful paintings of his late period. So, thank you for your time and attention today. I hope you will continue to follow with me my history of Western art. Goodbye for now.